Well, good morning and welcome to Paradise Church. My name is Austin Penn, and I'm so thankful that you decided to tune in to us this morning. I want to invite you that as you're listening to this video, would you mind liking this video? Would you mind commenting on this video? And maybe even consider sharing this video with your friends. One of the amazing opportunities that we have in this season of online church is that we have a great and easy way to share the gospel, the good news with the world around us, just by the click of a button. And so I want to invite you to do that today. I know that a lot of us are sitting here today at home and we're saying, man, how long are we going to stay online? How long are we going to stay away from the building? And I know that a lot of our congregation has been struggling being away from this place and being together. And so I thought it appropriate today to actually be right here on our stage. I know that this is a small way to make you feel a little bit more comfortable, but we want you to know that the staff hears you, that we are right there with you in desiring to be back together again, but that we also want to be wise and continue to have good conversation to make good decisions that are beneficial for everyone. At this time, I don't really have an update for you. You might have gotten an email yesterday from the board, and I know that they're going to continue to have deep conversations about what reopening the church is going to look like, and so stay tuned to those emails for that. But this morning, we're here. We're here, and so why don't we turn our ears to Jesus, to what he has for us to learn this morning? We've been going through this series called New Old, the book of Acts. And in this series, we've been talking about the church of the first century and how that relates to our world today. And you've heard from me, you've heard from Bree, and we've been talking through a lot of different things in Acts. And last week we heard a difficult word from Bree on the recount of the stoning of Stephen. And what's interesting about the story of the stoning of Stephen is that he was persecuted for his faith in following Jesus. And today we're picking up right where that left off. Today we're going to be in Acts 9, 1 through 9, and we're going to be talking about Saul. Some of you may know him as Paul, who later writes many letters in the New Testament. But here in this text, he is known as Saul. And so we're going to hear the word of the Lord this morning. I apologize. And we're going to see what we can learn about Saul. So the word of the Lord says this. It says, "But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found anyone belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And he said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do.' The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. And Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus, and for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank." The word of the Lord to you all this morning. So who is Saul? Who is Saul? We really see who Saul is right at the beginning of this text, but I want to take us back just a little bit further. You see, at the end of chapter 7, we see the stoning of Stephen, which we talked about last week. And the beginning of verse 8 opens like this. It says, "And Saul," the same Saul we're talking about this morning, "approved of his execution." Saul was the one who approved of Stephen's stoning. And on that day, there arose a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul, the same Saul we're talking about this morning, was ravaging the church. And entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. That is who Saul was. Saul was known as a persecutor of the church. Saul was not someone that he didn't really like the Christians. No, he hated the Christians. He executed Christians. He sought and pursued his life's mission against people that followed Jesus, literally bursting into their homes and dragging them out to be tried. That's the Saul we're talking about this morning, not the Paul you may know who wrote a lot of the New Testament, but it's the same person. You see, Saul, he was angry. He was angry against the Christians. And some people believe that perhaps he was angry because he couldn't understand the peace that they had in the face of knowing that they could die for the very thing they believed in. And so Saul, in the opening of our text, says that he was still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. And so, because he was so angry, he went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues of Damascus. You see, Saul was so angry against the believers that simply going house to house and ravaging Jerusalem was not enough for him. He saw that many of them went to Damascus, and so he pleaded before the high priest of the Sanhedrin and said, I want letters, I want documentation so that I can legally pursue these people even though they're not under my authority anymore. So he gets these letters of extradition so that he can go and attack these people and bring them back to Jerusalem so they can be charged for compliance with Stephen. And as we know, Stephen was stoned to death. And so he was really in pursuit of getting these people back to Jerusalem so that they could suffer the same fate as Stephen. And so he was going after these believers. And it's interesting in the text, it says that he was going after anyone who belonged to the way. And I love that phrase, the way. You see, I feel like it does a great job of describing what believers should be all about. It does a great job in communicating that as believers, we know this new way of salvation. As believers, we know this way of Jesus. And as believers, because of those two things, we know a new way of life. But Saul didn't stay in this place. Saul didn't stay in this place of anger and pursuit of these people in the way and trying to kill them and persecute them. No, something incredible happens. In verse 3 it says, now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus. So this tells us that he's probably very close to Damascus. He's almost right about to execute his plan that he was pursuing. And suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, which he's talking about, Damascus, and you will be told what you are to do. You see, in verses 3 through 6, we have this divine encounter. Saul sees and experiences Jesus firsthand. It is often thought that in this moment it was about midday, and so for a light to shine bright enough, it was something. It was miraculous. And there's a couple really important truths that come out of this moment, this divine encounter. We see first that God disrupts his plans. God disrupts his plans. Saul was planning to go to Damascus, and just as he's about to execute this plan, God disrupts it. We see that God disrupts his physical reality. Light came in a way that light should not come, in a supernatural way that doesn't make sense. God disrupted the physical reality of Saul. Something miraculous happened with this divine encounter. We see that God also disrupts Saul's heart. He says, Saul, Saul. And you know when someone says your name twice, they really want you to hear it. And perhaps you're in trouble. And it says, why are you persecuting me? You see this divine encounter with Jesus. Jesus makes it personal. He says, Saul, why are you hurting me? Why are you persecuting me? It disrupts Saul's heart, the way that he felt about things. Then we see that God disrupts Saul's theology. He asks, "Who are you, Lord?" Thinking mostly of a master. He says, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." A man who believed that the people that followed the way of Jesus were crazy now is having a radical encounter where his theology and his way of understanding the world is being questioned, and God is disrupting that by meeting him in a way that he never thought was really possible. But there's an incredible piece of comfort in all this disruption. Yes, God disrupted his plans and disrupted his physical reality and disrupted his heart and disrupted his theology, but God gives hope and guides a new way forward. Even in the midst of all this disruption, in verse 6 it says this, it says, "But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." You will be told what you are to do. I will guide you, is what God is saying to him. And so we have this legal pursuit that gets halted by a divine encounter with Jesus. And because of this divine encounter, Saul begins to follow. And there is a great result of this followership. And we see this in verses 7 through 9. The men who were traveling with him, they stood speechless. They heard the voice but didn't see anyone. You see, when we have a divine encounter like Saul did, there is results that occur from our followership. One, as we see here, other people's lives are changed. Just by us having a divine encounter and responding to that and following Jesus, our followership changes the lives of others as they see us follow God. There's a huge thing that happens here too in verse 8 is that Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were open, he saw nothing. So they led him by hand and brought him into Damascus. You see, Saul came with his plans, and he was ready to come in conquering and avenging and taking people of the way. But instead, he comes being led by hand in a humble fashion. You see, the result of the divine encounter and then following the divine encounter is that you get the freedom of being led. You don't have to carry so much tension in your shoulders. You don't have to carry so much anger like Saul did, but instead you get released in the freedom of simply being led. And in verse 8, we see that what happened to Saul shook him. It shook his very being. Some scholars even say that perhaps this was literal shock as we know it. He was without sight for 3 days, and he didn't eat or drink. You see, the result of followership, as I'm talking about here, is that it shocks our very being, not just for a moment, but for forever. As we know, for many of us that have read the Bible, especially the New Testament, we know that Saul later gets known as Paul, and that this moment right here, this divine encounter and his choice to respond and follow that changes his life now. Yes, I mean, he can't see or eat or drink, but it changed the course of his life forever to come. And so in conclusion, I want us to hear just a couple truths this morning from our text. One is this, is that an encounter with Jesus requires a realization of a radical new way forward. Let me say that again. An encounter with Jesus requires a realization of a radical new way forward. But after that, it's the choice of ours. It's the choice of ours if we choose to remain stubborn and say no to this new radical way, or it's the choice of ours to submit to this new way. You see, I believe very strongly that COVID-19, this virus that has changed the landscape of our world and the way we understand things, has been a divine encounter for many of us. I've seen Jesus in the midst of all of this, and I hope you have too. I've seen this divine encounter do the same things that happened to Saul to us. Man, has it disrupted our plans. Man, has it disrupted our way of life, our physical reality. Man, has it disrupted our heart for thinking and caring about things that perhaps we didn't care so much about before. And man, has it disrupted our theology. We've had to come to terms with how much of the church is reliant upon a building. Should we be in church right now? Should we be at home? These are theological questions, not just political questions, not just organizational questions. They're theological too in nature. And God has disrupted us with all these things, with our plans, with our way of life, our hearts, our theology. And it feels like chaos in the midst of all this disruption. But I want you to know, and I hope that you don't miss this, that the same hope that God offered to Saul, saying, "Go, I will show you. I will tell you what to do. I will guide you." God offers that hope to you today. God offers that hope that in the midst of all this disruption, that He is here. That He is here to help you, that He is here to walk step by step beside and with you and to guide you into a new, radical way forward. The world as we know it is different forever, and God wants to guide and usher us through this. So won't we let Him? That's our question today. That's our question today, is as we have these divine encounters, are we going to maybe be stubborn to just try to reopen and to resume the way we've lived? Or are we willing to reimagine a new radical way forward?